Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. And as always, before we get into today's show, I do have to plug our Patreon. As I say, every week, it's how we keep the lights on. It's how we're even able to make the podcast. We don't use, none of the money comes to me. I know everybody thinks that I probably just take all the money and hoard it. I've been watching Lord of the Rings this week, so like Smaug is what I'm going to say, and I store it all, but I don't. It literally goes to everybody involved behind the scenes, the people who edit it, the social media, new equipment. So if you can check out our Patreon, it's patreon.com/Nordic Mythology podcast. The main benefit is the Q&A we do with our guests every week. And that is basically just a shorter extension of the main show where the patrons get to ask their own questions. And there's a lot of questions that I miss. There's a lot of topics we cover. They're always a lot of fun. So if there is an episode you like, there is a bonus little bit on the end, and you get the whole back catalog when you sign up as well. It's not from when you sign up forward, you get everything prior. So there are years of bonus material on there now. And if you can't support, financially, then even just a like, share, 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast is always going to help somebody new find the show. But I'm really excited for today's show. I love anything macabre, death related. I don't know what that says about me, but I'm excited to get into this one. So my guest today is Emma Thompson, and Emma has a PR. You're in your second year.
I'm doing it. Yeah,
you're doing your PhD. I don't want to give you the props.
I have to do the work first. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You're in your second year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're in your second year of your PhD in Viking Age mortuary identities at the School of Archaeology and Ancient History at the University of Leicester. Is there anything else I need to add on to that?
No, that's me.
That might be one of the most fascinating things to study. Mortuary identities. Let's just start there. What does that involve?
Yeah. So I guess the easy way to kind of specify it is when graves are a really interesting thing, right? Because the dead can never bury themselves. And this is a really famous sort of statement that's going around in archaeology. It's like, once you're dead, you don't really have control over how you're buried. It's a case of you can give your wishes, especially nowadays, we have wills and things for that, but you can't bury yourself. It's just, metaphysically impossible. So it's this idea of what is the identity of the person in the grave versus what identity kind of the people doing the burying has put on top of that. And then what's the identity of the person versus what's the identity of the grave? What's the identity of the community where the person is buried, the cemetery, and all these different layers of like, actually, who are we looking at? What are we looking at? And I think sometimes we get so caught up on like this one person in a grave when actually there's so many different things going on. So I'm kind of studying all those various tiers of what does it mean for someone to die.
I love when there's questions that make me straight away just kind of
the brain starts going. It's like wait a second,
and reevaluate how I've looked at everything. And you've done it with it. I think you're maybe the fastest person to ever do it.
Straight in there. We can just call the show that.
Yeah, because I think I've probably fallen into the trap that I assume everybody does, and that is when you look at a grave, you are obsessed with the person in the grave, because I guess that's natural. You look at them, what the belongings are, what they've been given, and you try and create a persona of that person from those goods. Well, it seems as though there's a lot to be said about the people who've put them there, and that's an angle that I've never thought of, and what it says about the things that the culture, I guess, of the people they've left.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because I guess even if I say you're lucky enough to find a skeleton that says this leg bone belongs to, so and so, we don't actually ever know that, even if you've got like a gravestone saying like, Harold was buried here, we don't actually know that Harold was buried there. It could be someone who's standing in for someone else. It could be that Harold is like this community identity, and actually this one person is supposed to be lots of different things. And it's a case of, I think as people, we love stories, right? We love a narrative. We love like heroes and archetypes. So it's really easy to find a grave or a burial that kind of fits into maybe the stories we've been told, or just something that feels very neat. But actually it's so much more than that. There are so many different people who kind of are involved in this one grave, even if it's one sort of skeleton in there.
Mhm. Do you okay? I'm gonna go straight in with
Nope, do it.
I
Let's
was
go.
going. Do you think you can tell more about the person in the grave or the people who put the person in the grave and the goods?
100% the latter. I think it's you see more about who's putting the person in the grave than you see the person in the grave because we don't really know, right? Unless that person comes back to life and says, "Yes, this grave accurately reflects who I think I am as a person." It's always whatever the mourners, the buriers are doing in that space.
Hmm. Okay. And you mentioned wills,
Yep.
um, quickly, like in modern time. Do we have
Yeah.
any evidence of that from the Viking Age? I don't know. When
It
was the first will? I have no idea.
I don't know off the top of my head. I know there are a lot of, once we get into sort of the later period, so we're talking about sort of later Norway in the Viking Age, Iceland in the Viking Age, there are a lot of sort of law codes about how people are supposed to be buried and they can get really obscure and things like that. The one example I can think of is sort of in some Icelandic codes, and I'm not as literary as some of my colleagues are, so they might call me out for this, but the vague sort of gist of it is that the primary so the first time a person is buried is really important. You have to do it a certain way. But if for whatever reason you have to move the cemetery, so like you have to move the settlement or whatever, the second time you bury the person, there are a lot less rules. So it's really interesting about when does a dead person sort of have these rights versus sort of, if we're burying them for the second time, it's less important how we bury them. And it's just
Mhm.
these various stages of like, what does death mean and when and to who and sort of where.
Do you think that's because maybe the direct family or the immediate family isn't involved or the immediate friends aren't involved, so it's just kind of like you just move it and put it back over here
I
rather
mean,
than it being this big spectacle.
quite possibly, but I guess as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of specific timeline for it. So it could very easily be in your generation, let's say you've buried your parents, but you might have to move them because you've moved, and that's still within that sort of same time period. There
Mhm.
isn't really a sort of a statute of limitations on that kind of like rule set.
Yeah, but once
Yeah.
you've done it, once you've done it once, it's like, come
Doing
on,
it again. Yeah.
yeah, we're meant to do it all, like get everybody out, get your best clothes on. It's a lot,
But
isn't it?
I think it's really interesting to consider in terms of like when it comes to beliefs about death, it's almost that, well, when has that person moved on in a sense?
Hmm.
Because like in theory, maybe the first time you bury them, they're still sort of moving on. But if it's been if they've already moved on, then they're not there anymore, and it's okay to do these things. And it's that kind of, I guess, ideas of soul and when afterlife and whatnot, which I find really interesting, just how people interact with their dead.
Yeah, because you would assume that all the grave goods would indicate that the idea was that you were going to take these items
Mm,
with you. So it's kind of, I guess, what most people would associate with the Egyptians, the idea of that
yeah.
whatever is put with you, you take it, and that's what you're going to get in the afterlife. So at what point is it like, oh, you've got this now, so I can go in and take that really cool sort of that
So
really expensive brooch that I left with you.
this does happen in both like the literary examples and we've got examples of graves being opened. It's kind of this idea of like someone's buried with a really important sword and their personhood is associated with this sword, like this person is tied to the sword, and people go back into the grave, take the sword out because you get some of the power that that person and sword had, and then you sort of use that power for yourself. So it is like we've got examples of those, and we've got a lot of examples of particularly in Denmark, sort of Viking age burials being placed in older graves. So there's a site in Floystrup, which is a Viking age grave in a Roman age kist, so a stone coffin inside a Bronze Age mound. And if you just think
Okay.
about that sort of time connection, is just
It's,
so interesting to think about.
it's like graveception.
Yeah,
It's
grave.
just,
You just
and
like
it's just,
how far back can we go?
yeah. I guess it's a because we see it throughout time, no reusing of, like, I don't know if it's a better term for like holy spots or for important
Yeah.
religious spots. I mean, a lot of churches are built on previously important like religious sites. So it would make sense that they would reuse these things because it's not just a clear transition from one thing to the next that maybe textbooks make out.
Yeah.
There's there's a lot of grey in the middle between the two kind of things. Um, to go back, I'm really interested in this idea of, because they must know that when you bury somebody,
Mhm.
the things that you bury them, because I mean, I guess when you slaughter a horse or a cow, those things they know that they're dead, so they've killed them, they've gone with them, so you can't take them out and reuse them. But
Mhm.
when it's things of great value, whether it's gold or weaponry
Yeah.
or ironwork or fabrics, they must know that they don't physically go to the afterlife, because if they go through a process of digging graves up, they must know that these items are in there. Yes, maybe they've decayed a little bit, but for a lot of items, like I guess like the gold and the iron, they'll take
Mm.
they take a long time to really break down. So if it is in someone's lifetime, they'll know that they don't physically go. So
Yeah.
there must be that kind of thing of like, oh well, we know they don't really go. Like the body kind of goes, and we know they don't really go. So maybe they've just like kind of taken them, but we can reuse some of it.
Yeah, I have, I guess, two responses to that. The first one is that we do have some examples in Norway of the person's died, and in the cremation grave with them is a broken sword. And these
Mhm.
swords have been intentionally broken to kind of, it's been argued that sort of to match the death of the person, there's the broken object, the death of the object. And sometimes we do see objects killed and sort of dying in the same way that people are, and sort of almost co-buried in a sense. And the second thing I'd say is we don't know what kind of organic material is going into the grave. So, like you said,
Mhm.
textiles really doesn't survive very well. Food that got put in the grave,
Yeah.
we can't really see that. So it's that case of there are lots of things we can't see. And I think the fact that even in sort of inhumation graves where maybe the objects are still intact, they're being removed, and it does take effort to then dig them back out again. So it's that case of maybe at least temporarily the object is almost dying in a way as well, because a lot of these objects are useful objects. So thinking of even just jewelry, for example, brooches, pinning the dresses up, you could use that through several generations, but sometimes they're choosing to remove that. And it's that question of, well, why and what is this saying? And
Mhm.
sometimes it's identity, sometimes it's almost like this time capsule of the community in one space as well.
Mhm.
So lots of different things going into that.
There must be a lot of honor behind it, because
Yeah.
there mu- there must be a temptation to be like, okay, well, dad's died raiding, like he's come back, like they brought him back, or he died when he got back, and we're gonna have to bury him, and he wants burying with like his sword and all his jewelry and all these
Mm.
nice things. There must be the temptation of the sons or daughters or wife to be like, I really could use that gold,
Yeah.
and I really could use that sword or that axe, or so maybe we just don't bury it with him. So I guess it must show that there is either a huge honor thing behind it, or there really is a really strong belief that they need this in the next life. But then is that kind of counteracting the breaking of the swords? Because would you send a warrior on if they need an intact sword with a broken sword?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think there is a lot. So in terms of sort of burial in the past, it's really hard sometimes to get at like the emotions of it, because how do we see, emotions in the ground sort of thing? And I think a lot of archaeologists talk about this idea of when you bury someone, you bury them with personal items that kind of make you think of these people. One example was like someone doesn't look like themselves unless they've got their glasses, so they were buried with their glasses. And it's that case of you almost can't remove that person from the object. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, this is useful, but actually this is so coded in who that person was or who this community is that we have to just that dies with them in a sense. And then in terms of the breaking of swords, yeah, I can see sort of the, well, why do we want to give a warrior in the afterlife a dodgy sword sort of thing? But I think it's also just to reflect the transformation that death does to people and sort of communities and thoughts. So it's probably doing two things there.
Could it be? as simple as they would break a sword to deter anybody wanting to go and steal from it? Because could it be a case
Quite
of like,
possibly, yeah.
we've had loads of people stealing swords from graves,
Yeah.
so we're just going to break it and be like, it'll be fine, it'll get fixed wherever they're going, they'll get the
Yeah.
whole thing, but we don't want people to steal it.
Quite possibly, and it's really locational as well. So these broken swords, generally, there's lots of them in Norway. There are no, as far as I know, broken swords in Danish graves, and that might just be because Danish graves are usually sort of they're not burnt; they're just put straight into the ground. So maybe there's not this connection between breaking and cremation. But also, we get loads of broken swords in Danish sort of lakes and bogs and things like that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
where is it appropriate to break a sword versus sort of Denmark versus Norway kind of thing. So there's lots of different regional practices as well, which are probably based in belief systems that unfortunately no one wrote down.
That made me, because am I right in thinking that with a lot of the bog style bodies, were they people who were deemed lesser by society or criminals or unfortunately in a lot of cases like homosexuals? Like,
Yeah.
could it be that the broken sword might be an indication of how they lived in life, whether it was they were a criminal or maybe dishonored in some way? So it was like an almost a nod that maybe they were a warrior, but they did something that
Mm.
was dishonorable. Maybe something even as simple as fleeing in battle. So they've maybe fled and were, I don't know. I don't know if Vikings did that, but I assume they
Yeah.
probably did. If somebody fled in battle, it would
Yeah.
be, a dishonor, so they could have been killed and then their sword snapped and put in with them.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good suggestion. It's kind of hard to tell, I guess, with those Norwegian examples because with cremated burials, you tend to get less of the sort of like elaborate grave good assemblages. So we can't really look at it and go, well, this broken sword is with this and this, and that kind of tells us a bit more about like the deviant status, I suppose, because with inhumation burials, with deviants, you tend to get sort of they're lying face down instead of sort of face up, which
Okay.
is more normal, or you'll get loads of sort of stones put on them so they can't escape from the grave
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. So we're not getting that sort of multiple bits saying like, oh, this person wasn't well regarded. So it definitely possible. It's just we haven't got as much to work with there.
Perfect. Okay, let's go into the actual
Yeah.
topic of the show, which is the Repton Warrior. Do you want to give a quick little
Yeah.
intro into who it was or what it is?
Yeah, so I might start with just, I guess, establishing Repton itself. I'm sure loads of people know about it who's listening, but just sort of to place that. So Repton is a village in South Derbyshire, which was a significant royal and religious site in the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Mercia, kind of being formed around the 600s. And the Viking enthusiasts among us sort of know it because it was in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. We were told that the Viking Great Army wintered there from 873 to 874. And the problem was for a long while, we had all these written records and place names and all these things telling us that Scandinavians were in the UK or sort of in England, but we didn't have a lot archaeologically.
Mm-hmm.
And until the 1970s, where oh boy, we found some burials, and oh, they look a bit Scandinavian, and this is getting a bit exciting. And there are loads and loads of different burials of Repton, which are really interesting to think about from different perspectives. But the Repton Warrior is quite an interesting one because they get a lot of attention. We don't really find lots of stereotypically Scandinavian burials in England. So sort of these have been very exciting to those of us who are like, oh God, we've got something that looks like what we think it should look like.
Mm-hmm.
And this one in particular is probably discussed quite a lot, and this might be a spoiler alert for what we go into later on, but they took a really nasty injury to their inner thigh, which supposedly cut the femoral artery, removed their genitals all in one swoop. And then
Mm-hmm.
in the burial, there was a boar's tusk placed between the thighs. So there's been a
Mm-hmm.
lot of discussion about what that means. But there's also sort of loads going on in terms of there's a sword, there's jewelry, there's religious iconography. It's just a really interesting burial to see in England, and it's gotten a lot of attention.
Perfect. What makes it Scandinavian? What are the things that you look for when you find a grave and straight away you go, okay, this is Viking versus like Anglo-Saxon?
Yeah, so obviously this is painting with a really broad brush. But what we previously were looking for is sort of this is the diagnostic sort of Scandinavian grave is west to east sort of orientation because Christianity sort of flips that on its head. They're probably lying on their back. They've got lots of objects. Well, not necessarily lots of objects, but they've got objects in the grave because sort of the theory is that as we switch to Christianity, we start putting less emphasis on grave goods because we just sort of shift what's important for the afterlife or a good death and whatnot. So we're looking for a burial facing a certain way with objects in it because Christianity flips
Just
the orientation and takes the stuff out.
just donate all that lovely gold to the
Yeah,
church
just
instead.
just just keep hold of
Keep,
it. Stop giving
give
it
it
to,
us.
the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, just give it the church. Give
But
it
yeah,
Christ. Christ
tithe to the
Christ needs
church,
that gold.
yeah, the church needs it more than you
Yeah,
do.
Christ needs a lot of gold. Apparently, that's one thing I've learned. He needs
Yeah.
tons and tons of gold.
He's got to buy the fish somewhere.
Well, yeah. So okay, so we have a load of grave goods.
Yeah.
Do we? Are you then looking at the individual ones to see, I guess, the artwork on them or the style that they're made? Is that then going to indicate where the
Yeah.
person comes from?
So usually in terms of, so there are lots of different ways to figure out sort of how old something is archaeologically. And one of the ways is by art style, particularly in the Viking Age, because sort of that's sometimes all we've got to work with. It's sort of these different art styles. So yeah, we are looking for, does this come from a particular part of Scandinavia? Is this art style? Is this material usage a certain period? And yeah, this Repton Warrior has a sword that sort of matches up to the time period of the Great Army and whatnot. They've also got some jewelry in the burial, which I often find quite interesting that people sort of don't always want to associate jewelry and swords together because it gets a bit confusing. But yeah, he's got a couple of beads and a Thor's hammer sort of amulet as well.
Okay. Um, we say he. How do we know he's a he? Because I know I can't remember who. I think it was Georgia Soteti who we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about. How little Thor's amulets are mainly found in female graves.
Yep. Yep. So that is me. Ooh, that's me partially sort of just being so used to people saying this is a him, this is a
Yeah,
he, sort of going into it. But we don't, we don't know for certain.
because I guess the boar's tusk would be some indication to that.
Yeah, so there are kind of two theories that are sort of present at the moment about what that kind of means. And one of them is obviously that this boar's tusk is kind of standing in for the penis that he lost. It's kind of this sort of statement on masculinity, or Julian Richards talks about the idea of do male warriors need their penises in Valhalla? Is that something important to have in the afterlife? My supervisor, Mariana Hem Eriksson at Leicester, and Claire Rattigan, they propose this idea of actually maybe it's this sort of human boar cyborg. It's almost this sort of commingling, shape-shifting human animal entity. Um,
As
but
as in Berserker like, because obviously that's what's going to come to
potentially,
mind, I guess.
because that's in sort of the belief system. So it's possibly something to do with masculinity, maybe, but it's also possibly something to do with the relationships that Vikings perceived humans and animals to have at the time.
Hmm. Wonderful. What about it? I guess because the church was there, right?
Yeah,
Before, so we'll say he's buried like just outside the church, but
yeah.
really close to the church. Do you think there's any significance to that?
So what's also really interesting, so first of all, Repton Warrior, they're in a double grave. So it's the Repton Warrior, which we think is the older burial. And then there's a younger individual in that same sort of space, who, with aDNA analysis, we know is either their father and son or they're really close brothers. But sort of the age gap suggests it's father and son. And then on top of sort of both these graves, there's a stone layer, and that's made up of broken stone crosses, probably from the church. So I think it's actually quite a big statement of, especially maybe with a Thor's hammer, this sort of subjection of that church and sort of this victory almost over, what was there before. Because yeah, we figured out that it's stone crosses broken up in that sort of stone layer on top of both these burials.
That's fascinating because would that be um, a clear way to kind of, I guess, defy Christ? And because I know that's a theory that's battered around a
Mm,
lot, but then I know there's some scholars who are quite against the idea of this intentional destruction of Christian iconography. And I know a lot of people think it's not really that deep. Like we have this, I think anybody who I mentioned the lovely Facebook groups on here all the time that they're out
yeah.
there, the Viking ones, and there's this huge hatred for Christianity in a lot of people who are into this kind of stuff. And I think from people for a lot of scholars I've spoken to, just that wasn't the case,
Yeah.
1,000 years ago. It wasn't that big split. So the idea that it would have been an intentional destruction of the crosses.
Yeah, I think it's obviously like it's a lot more nuanced probably than we can see. My sort of a lot of my research deals with this combination of kind of Danish but wider Scandinavian migration to England and sort of the religious changes. Obviously, England is Christianized by this point. Denmark is starting to, and these sort of different dynamics of, where are people religiously, where are people sort of in location. And I think it's not like Scandinavians have never seen Christianity before. We've obviously got missionaries sort of coming through. It's not completely new to everyone. And I do think it's this kind of, it's perhaps more regional in sort of Repton. It's not specifically like, the pagans are asserting dominance over Christianity. It's sort of they're carving a space in this new locale and they're sort of breaking what was there rather than it specifically being religion, because obviously there's sort of a lot of acculturation and sort of people settling and sort of coming to terms with things. So it's a marking of transition, perhaps more so than a specific, pagan versus Christian statement.
Mm-hmm. Could it be that he was Christian, so it was put in because I guess we would assume that they broke the crosses to put them in there, but maybe
Yeah.
they were already damaged,
Mm.
and they thought, well, we'll put them in there as a sign of this kind of blend. Because I think a lot of people need to appreciate that it's not just pagan Christian. There is a lot
Yeah.
of blend, and
So
people
much
will be
transition. Yeah.
yeah, and people are crafty. People are Christian when they need to be Christian, and they're
Yeah.
pagan when they want to be pagan. They'll they play the system.
I feel like my default sort of like example of this is in The Mummy when Benny's sort of in front of Imhotep and sort of going through every single religious necklace he's got to see whichever one works in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some really cool artifacts in Denmark, which is basically metal casting stones for pendant sort of for necklaces. And we've got several examples of stones which have two Thor's hammers molds and then a cross in the middle. So it's not just, the Norse gods or Christianity, it's both at the same time for different audiences for different reasons. And it's one of my favorite sort of artifacts because it's so clear that because sometimes we talk about, especially Denmark, it's pagan and then it's Christian and that's it. Like there's no crossover, but actually it's both at the same time in very sort of weird different ways.
I love the Mummy reference, but I feel like
Yeah.
you completely outed your age there.
I'm
Like
so sorry.
that's so no, I don't. I'm not bothered. But I feel like that's such a specific
Yeah.
reference
Yeah.
that you have to be a very similar age to me. I feel
Yeah.
because I remember watching the movie so much when I was younger.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is how it was. That for trade, for trade, you're going to be Christian
Yeah.
because that opens the doors for a huge trade network. So, okay. So back to the burial.
Yeah.
We have what we presume is a gentleman, and he has a Thor's hammer. And what other goods does he have? And then you mentioned that it's maybe his son or brother.
Yeah.
What relevance do you think there is to that?
So in terms of the goods he's got, just kind of listening off. So there's the Thor's hammer. There's a couple of beads suggesting there's the necklace. Sort of bits of belt buckle and whatnot. There's the sword that we sort of use as the, this is a warrior kind of assumption. Some knives, which are really, really common in sort of Viking. I'm not going to say pagan properly, but pagan in air quotes, sort of knives. If there is a grave good in the grave, it's probably a knife for Vikings across the board. They've also got a key, which is quite interesting because the key tends to be also a little bit feminine coded. So there is a sort of blending of different things in here. And obviously the boar's tusk in the middle, but there's also a bit of a jackdaw sort of corvid sort of wing bone in there as well, which might have been a bag, might not have been a bag, but sort of also between the thighs.
Okay, uh, this might be
Yeah.
completely wild. Um, I remember when I spoke with Leszek
Yeah.
Gadera
Yeah.
about female warrior graves, and he mentioned about how it's probably likely because obviously there's this huge idea of shield maidens and
Yeah.
this idea in modern time that it was very very free and women could just go to war, where it probably wasn't. That doesn't mean that there weren't female warriors. It means it just probably wasn't quite as
Yeah.
open as media portrays it today. And he said that maybe there would be this cross dressing for women to then be able to go to war. And what movie is it where there is a lady that does that? I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm sure
Oh.
somebody might remember in the chat. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's probably a few, but he was saying there's
Oh,
a few different cultures that
Mulan was
Mulan,
suggested. Yeah.
yeah. So is it possible that this boar's tusk that it could be a female warrior, and the boar's tusk is almost a, I guess, a kind of trying to get them into, let's say if it is Valhalla or wherever, like
Yeah.
that kind of they were a regarded warrior, and maybe they knew that they were female, and this idea that it's meant to be male warriors, and it's that kind of thing. Like they wanted to just give her that little nudge with the boss tusk. Is that insane?
Quite possible. The problem is, off the top of my head, I can't. So they did the ADNA analysis to see whether these two people were related. I can't remember if they also did the gender genetically as well. So I might, sorry, the sex genetically as well. So I might be missing something. But that, like, it's not a bad suggestion to sort of like that kind of shape shifting, sort of transformation, just sort of crossing different borders. I think in general, obviously the Birka warrior that was believed to be male turned out to be genetically female, caused a lot of stir in sort of Viking studies and publicly. And I think from that, we've been figuring out that gender is maybe a bit less defined in the Viking Age, at least the way that we maybe see it today than we thought. Because I know in my database for Denmark, perhaps it leans more towards what we'd expect, but there are so many examples of like, there is, someone genetically sexed as male who has jewelry, women have swords, and that doesn't necessarily mean the obvious, like women went to war or anything like that, but it just means that this idea of what gender is more complicated than we've thought. So this idea of
Yeah.
this warrior has the sword and everything, which doesn't always mean warrior, but the injury suggests probably they were. But then a few feminine coded items that sort of just nuance that picture a bit more.
Mhm. I think things were more based on what you could do versus
Yeah.
what you kind of had between your legs. We sit in the 21st century where things are relatively comfortable for most people, so you can focus on other things. Whereas 1,000 years ago, a lot was defined by what you could do, whether you could go and plow the fields, whether you can go to war and take what you needed. And there was a lot of emphasis on that. So if you were a female and you could hold your
Mm.
own, then I don't see why there would be any instance where you'd be like, no, you can't do that. Because at the end of the day, you want the work done, and everybody's going to benefit from the work done or from having a successful raid.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a case of if you can do the work, then sure, let's do the work. And if you can't, then we'll find another
We'll
thing for you
find
to
somewhere
do.
else for you. You can wash the pot in the back. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I think I've got sort of, I guess, two thoughts in response to that. The first being, I guess so much of our modern thoughts around gender is really heavily cemented in sort of the Victorian era and sort of how that defined and categorized gender and things like that. So I think sometimes it's so easy to feel like the Vikings were just like us, but in a different time period. But actually, they might have thought about gender really, really different to us. And sometimes we need to accept that actually maybe the Vikings were quite strange and not as familiar as they feel sometimes when we,
Hmm.
cart them out in sort of cartoons and TV shows and sort of, this whole heritage industry around Vikings or whatnot. And then the second one is that for my master's, I did a lot about the relationships between gender and I guess social status in Denmark. And I was finding that we're only really seeing anything in the grave that you could maybe say is gender, kind of the higher status they were. So it's that question of, well, who can materialize gender and death? Who's worried about gender and death? And sort of how are different people thinking about gender? It's not that they probably, that, I'm not saying sort of poorer people weren't thinking about gender, but could they sort of manifest that in a grave in the same way that someone who maybe could lose those fancy brooches more easily could? And it's where are we
Hmm.
seeing gender, when and why?
Hmm. It's it's so fascinating because every time, obviously, we'll get off the because I know this isn't your necessarily your area,
Yeah.
um, but it's so fascinating every time we have these conversations about gender and sex. You get a big group of people get so upset about it,
Yeah.
um, and it's because for whatever reason, I guess through popular culture, you have these two kind of extremes of hyper masculine Viking warrior males, and then on the other side, like very liberated, free and warrior females. And both camps have like people who really get into it. I would say that the hyper masculine male one is probably more problematic, but you get those two things of kind of opposite sides, and yeah, I think it can cause quite a little bit of problems. And I think it's so far from the truth. I think it was a lot more nuanced and complicated because people are complicated. Like, sorry to go off on a
No,
on a
no,
little
no, no,
rant,
go,
but I
you
guess
go.
but I guess people. I just think people are people. People have never changed being people, whether it's now 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago. That we're all a little bit complicated, and you can't put humans of any kind into any little box, particularly not two camps of male,
Yeah.
female, because we all just do our own things, and we all do even more weird things when everybody else isn't looking. So we're all just complicated creatures.
Yeah, and I think, and it's something that's coming into sort of different disciplines a lot more is this idea of intersectionality, which was coined by Crenshaw, sort of around legal systems. But this idea of like, okay, I may identify as a woman, but I'm not just a woman, and I'm not just a woman to the same degree in every space. Like in some spaces, I might feel like I need to enact my femininity more than I need to enact other things. And sort of it's these conditional variations of it's not just woman has the same experience as woman B and sort of do the same thing the entire way
Mm-hmm.
through. And I also think when obviously Viking gender comes up a lot and it can be a very hotly contested subject, but I also think when we talk about Viking gender, we are really masculine heavy. So it's either this hyper masculine male or it's this sort of masculine female in different spaces that, we don't
Okay,
expect
yeah.
them. but we don't talk about kind of the femininity of either men in the Viking Age or sort of non-binaryism in the Viking Age, or sort of that feminine side doesn't get as much of a look in because we're either going hyper masculine men or warrior women. And it's like, well, there must be another side to kind of that coin as
Hmm.
well, right?
Hmm. Yeah, there has to be. I remember, I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but I remember reading
Mm,
a study that was like, if you put a group of people, of maybe like five people, into a situation, the same five roles will always filter out one way
mm,
or another. You'd have like, I'd have to try and find it, but
yeah.
you'd have maybe like a more masculine, and then naturally somebody would take a more maybe like feminine style role, and somebody would take more of like a healer or caring role, and these roles
Mm,
would just automatically define themselves, whether it was five women, five men, or five mixed gender. Like
yeah.
these kind of roles automatically just kind of filter and happen. And I think it would be the case back then. You have to have, it's yin and yang, isn't it? If you have
Yeah.
this masculine warrior side, you have to have the other side. It just it just is.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I guess, the way we perceive some of those different traits. Like I saw something on the artist formerly known as Twitter, which kind of pissed me off a little bit, which was this idea of like leadership is a masculine trait. And I understood the logic, but it's kind of a case of, well, what kind of leadership? Where is that leadership? Because thinking like not even just sort of Viking women, but sort of ancient Greek women running the household, sort of running the finances, things like that. Like that is still
Mhm.
leadership. It's just in a different sphere, in a different space. And it's kind of weird to put something like that so gender coded because it's, as you say, it's different spaces, it's different roles, it's different things that, all these different traits are going to come to the fore as and when they need to.
Mhm. Yeah. I think that public like leadership roles probably have tended to be more masculine or male, but
Mm.
really we all know behind the scenes that us men are not in we're not in charge. We get told and we do. And that's just how it is.
But I guess the question I'd pose to you in response to that is when does public become private and vice versa? Because I think sometimes we think it's really obvious. There's a split there, but there's transitionary spaces, and when does something that's private leadership become public leadership and all that sort of thing. So
Mhm.
I'm thinking like some of the
Uh,
long hauls of the Vikings, that could be a very private space, but could be a very public space as well.
mhm. Yeah, I think that you have this very public. It probably would go back to the Viking Age, and still
Mm.
rings true probably today, 'cause that you would have a very public kind of masculine figure, but it's always like the whispers in the ears. It always makes me think of Game of Thrones
Yeah.
and Varys, and like that there is so much power in knowledge and being the one that listens. And just because you're not the loudest and you're not the
Mm.
strongest, I think that women have probably in more modern times adapted to the roles that were put on them and just become smarter with it and controlled from not controlled but like had their say from another way. And it's just
Yeah.
that kind of evolution. And I think that was probably the same back there. You would have a king, and but he would still love his wife in the same way that I would love my partner.
Yeah.
And you would listen and you would sit. I'm sure they would sit and talk on an evening, and he would have counsel and he would take opinions. And maybe he doesn't listen because
Mm.
those men can be pig-headed sometimes. But I'm sure that would happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm kind of working on a little bit at the moment is this idea of an archaeology of coziness, which is this idea of, yes, the past was probably bleaker than, we've got more luxuries, some of us in sort of certain places have more luxuries than we did. But, you know, we're still human. We're still sort of people at the end of the day. There are still these moments of affection and emotion and sentiment, and
Mhm.
these fill the gaps that we can't see all the time. We're sort of missing, those really domestic, person to person moments that we can't catch in sort of
Mhm.
a grave or on a piece of historical text. And we need to
Yeah.
allow for that in our interpretation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've gone so off topic, so we'll get back
No,
on
you're
it. But I
so
think,
funny.
yeah, but I think every warrior, no matter you have this idea of a warrior, they still love a cuddle. They
Yeah,
still would have loved a cuddle on an evening.
don't
They
we
still would
all?
have had
Yeah.
that. Yeah, exactly. So that would have been there, and I think we have to remember. I think it's just with everything we have to remember that human side. Because when you
Yeah.
look at history, it's easy to strip that kind of human feeling and a human emotion away from it. But let's get back to the
Yeah.
actual
Yeah. Yeah.
grave, I guess. All right. So the the son or brother
Yeah.
were they
Yeah.
put there together? Would they have died at the same time in, I
So
guess, the same battle?
yeah, we don't know 100% for certain. The suggestion is that the Repton Warrior was buried first, and then the son, brother, whomever they are, was buried between a couple of months to at most a few years after. So there is still a really, like, let's say allowing for a few years, there's still a really intentional connection between these two people. And
Mhm.
I guess you could argue that's maybe, these people have come over from Scandinavia, they're creating these new communities and families in different spaces, and they just want to link that together. It's a really important way of, I guess, establishing kinship. Um, and just, I guess, in a way, because the younger one has less stuff in it, which isn't necessarily like that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I guess connecting that person to the person with more stuff gives the younger person a bit more power in a sense because it's linked to
Okay.
this fancier
Mhm.
grave.
Mhm. I guess it shows an activity in an area and
Yeah,
I guess some sort of control of that area that they were able to either set up camp there for a couple of years or they were able to go back there at will or
yeah.
with the ability to go back there to particularly bury somebody.
Yeah, it's this idea of legacy in a sense. It's obviously connecting two people together, but also these two people to a place where these specific things happened and sort of showing that reach in a sense. It's not just a one and done, it's a extended period. And there's a lot of conversation about, well, what was Repton like post, wintering of the army? And, arguably, we probably have people settling, we have that Scandinavian influence going on. We just can't see as much of it. So it's making that connection and really kind of memorializing that in the landscape. You sort of said like we're here, we've stayed, sort of thing, and you're really expressing that in the burial evidence.
Okay, this I guess is just me using
Mhm.
a little bit of my knowledge of the area. You have the the Repton Warrior and son or brother.
Yeah,
They're buried kind of they're on their own. There's some significance to it. They have the crosses on top. They have the grave
yeah,
goods. How important do you think this warrior was? Because obviously, I know maybe what 500 meters away in
yeah,
in the vicarage kind of
yeah,
garden, you have is was it, am I right in thinking there was a mass grave of hundreds of bodies? So what makes
yeah.
this warrior so special? Do we and are there any other individual warrior graves or individual graves at all in the area?
Yeah, so I guess let's tackle the mass burial first. So that big mound's not with where the Repton Warrior is, where there's a few other burials, but sort of that mound's a bit further away. I think it's something like 260 individuals have been identified in that kind of like mass burial. Off the top of my head, they're kind of between sort of late teenagers to early 40s, 80% of men, 20% of women in theory. And then they're kind of all framed around this individual in the middle, who I don't believe we've got the skeletal material for, but there's this idea of coffin in the middle.
Oh, okay.
But
So
yeah,
just I never knew
yeah,
that. So there's somebody in the middle with
yeah,
that's pretty metal. If you're gonna go to
it's
be
pretty
buried
cool.
with 200
Yeah.
people around you,
So
that's
the mass burial part, the 200 people, they're secondary burial. So it's not the first time they were buried. In theory, they were either buried somewhere else first. Maybe it's the army and sort of they've died in war. They buried them somewhere temporarily and they've moved them. Or at the very least, they've become skeletons. Like they were buried as skeletons, rather than sort of fresh bodies.
How do you know that? Just I don't know if
Yeah,
that's like a quick answer we
yeah.
can just interject with. Like, how do you know that it's been
You can
moved?
just kind of tell where the decomposition on the body is. So we can tell the sort of the skeletal state went into the grave rather than decomposition happened in the grave. So we know sort of the mass burials, they were moved from elsewhere. Don't exactly know where, but sort of they were all secondary interred. And the suggestion is the person in the middle of the grave, they suggested was 9 feet tall, which
Okay.
probably isn't true. I'm going to sort of put myself out there and say probably wasn't a giant. Some people have suggested it's Ivar the Boneless because that boneless sort of moniker has been interpreted in different ways of maybe he was really tall, so 9 foot
Mhm.
person in the middle, but we've got nothing to really prove that. But yeah, it is kind of like metal in a way. It's just sort of framed around this, but we don't know enough about
Mhm.
the person in the middle. But that's quite a
Are there
unique.
any grave goods?
There are sort of odd coins and things which helped us date it. So we had coins very specifically to kind of the time period of the Great Army. But for a very long
Mhm.
time, it was believed that the grave goods and the bodies didn't match time-wise because radiocarbon dating can be a bit fiddly depending on sort of how much fish people eat or how much water gets into the samples and things like that. So for a very long time, they were like, oh, the goods don't match the bones. But Kat Jarman, who's, amazing, has sort of worked out that things tie together, things make sense time-wise.
Mhm.
I think there's a couple of swords in there as well from memory. But yeah, it's a mix of different people. So it's a really just interesting mass burial in general. But that's very separate to kind of the Repton Warrior and the few other people around who there are a few warrior graves as well. So it's perhaps, I sort of say this tentatively, like, I guess, people of command in the army versus sort of just your infantry soldiers, perhaps, or just anyone who sort of died en route that they had to move. So it could be that distinction between the two sort of burial spaces.
The body in the
Hmm.
middle,
Yeah.
does did they have any grave goods in like a sword
Off
on were they moved there as well?
off the top of my head, I don't think we know loads about it. I think we've got a coffin in the middle. I'll double check this. I think there's a coffin in the middle, but no body, no grave goods, and it's just suggested that I think someone at some point in history said, "Oh, there's a giant buried there," because they opened it up once, reclosed it, sort of thing. And since then we've been like, well, someone said there was a giant in there, so there's probably something in
Yeah.
there.
Okay. Were coffins common?
It depends. So it kind of the more Christian it gets generally, the more coffiny it gets. Before that, you sort of in the like thinking of Viking Age Denmark, they sometimes had these big chamber graves with either sort of wagons or boats in, but coffins tend to come in more as Christianity comes in.
Hmm. Are they the same age? The Repton Warrior and the mass grave?
I think so, because I think everything's dating to that kind of wintering um, kind of time frame. It's quite a tight. The Repton Warrior got really tightly dated with radiocarbon, so we're quite confident that it matches up to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles.
I guess so. The Am I right in thinking that it's the Repton's on the river? I'm thinking just for anybody
Yeah,
listening, it's close by to the river, and I think is the idea that they wintered on this little bit of land
yeah,
and made some sort of fortress or like some sort of barricades around the outside and had like
yeah.
a little camp or settlement there. Um, do you think that the location of a church being there was significant?
I think one argument I've heard sort of being said is this was a really important site, sort of for Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, for Mercian kingdoms. It was a really important, quite complexly structured religious and royal site. So kind of taking of that as a wintering campsite is quite a significant, look, we've taken this space, we're entering into this
Okay, yeah.
complex network of things. So yeah, I think it was very intentional.
Because I'm trying to remember because when I visited, I couldn't go down into the little mausoleum
Yeah.
inside the church. And I can't remember, is that older? I can't
Should be
remember.
slightly older, I think, off the top of my head.
Because it's like, yeah, it was under renovation when I went, and there's like a little.
Yeah.
I remember there's like a little mausoleum thing in there, and I really wanted to sneak down there and just like have a look, but
Yeah.
I couldn't. I couldn't. I made it halfway down the stairs, and I looked, and it was all sheeted off with building stuff, and
You were like, I've gone
like
too far. I can't commit to this.
yeah, there was the like the metal supports that they use for holding
Yeah.
walls up, and also I was down there, and I was like, oh, I don't want to be the guy that broke in and then knocked one and the church fell down and just go down in history as that dickhead. So I didn't do it.
Yeah.
um okay, is there anything more we know or need to know about the Repton Warrior in particular? And because we're nearly an hour
Mhm.
already, and I know we spoke before about how we could maybe do a couple of these and look at the cultural significance of
Yeah.
burials and how we determine whether they're Viking or not versus because how they assimilate into the culture and it's really difficult. So other than that, because we can come back and do that as
Mhm.
an episode, is there anything else we need to know about the Repton Man before I give my rant about how I don't like how the Repton Man is left?
Oh, I guess the only thing I'd mention is obviously the Repton stuff, the Repton Warrior, that kind of site is not in isolation. We mentioned a little bit about Heathwood, which is very close by, which has sort of the cremation Viking cemetery in England. Um, and that one's really interesting in terms of that might be more sort of war dead associated with Repton. And very recently, they figured out that there's some animals burnt in that cremation cemetery as well, who've come over from Scandinavia. So it's not just, they're
Oh.
coming over for war completely necessarily because they've brought animals over, maybe they're settling or maybe that's, for supplies, but it's not just human people are moving, they're bringing lots of different animals and things with them. So I think Heathwood's really interesting for just that extra dynamic because it's so close by.
Mm-hmm. I guess, yeah, for anybody that is new to Heathwood, Heathwood is like a wooded area with lots of cremation sites.
Yeah.
And I remember trying to think when I researched when I was like looking it up myself,
Yeah.
were there some like ritual stuff possibly maybe?
Quite possibly, probably.
Um, but what do you think the significance is of this huge cremation site? Because
Mm.
it's it's very, or I think it's odd, maybe it's not odd to you that you have this huge cremation site, a mass grave, and then a individual soul, like person, well,
Yeah.
not on their own, but with a kin and the grave good. So you kind of have like these three separate like types of burial.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of my pet peeves is sort of when people sort of assume that Scandinavian burial is completely just the same across Denmark, Sweden, Norway, or what was the equivalent back then. Because I've
Mm-hmm.
always been I'm the Danish burial person, and sort of my Swedish burial people would be like, everyone was cremated in the Viking Age, and I'd be like, ha ha ha, not the Danes. So I think it's a really interesting. The cremation part is a really interesting contrast to Repton, because obviously you've got the mound of, these people were buried as was rather than burned. And then Heathwood, you've got this mass sort of cremation cemetery. So there's this suggestion of like, is that different types of Vikings very close
Right. Okay.
together? And is that different sort of regional cultural beliefs? And then, as you said, there's sort of just lots of different bits there. So I think it's this idea of even when the Scandinavians are coming over, they're not coming over as one thing. There's still lots of
Mm-hmm.
different beliefs and practices going on, even when they've come to England and then have to maybe synthesize down a bit more. But it's just there's still sort of people doing their own thing and sort of reflecting different thinking.
Mhm. I think that is a brilliant point that needs to be reiterated for the entire Viking Age, that not all Scandinavia is just
Yeah.
one individual kind of machine. That
Mhm.
you had, it's a group of countries across a time period that things will have been different geographically across, I guess, a big
Yeah.
land mass. And to be able to just say that everything is the same, and I think people fall into this trap of just going, "Oh well, the Vikings did this, or
Yeah.
Scandinavians did this," and it's not that simple. Whether it's runes or burials or anything like that, you will have regional differences in probably within like 50 miles. You'd have complete regional
Yeah.
differences, let alone across hundreds of miles. So I think it's something that needs to be remembered across it all.
Well,
And then I guess
it's
you would
that.
have you'd have
Yeah.
Vikings. No, go on. Sorry.
All I was going to say, because it's funny to me as someone who lives in the Midlands, I'm just thinking, even now, if you ask different cities in the Midlands, what do you call a bread roll?
Oh, that. So
We're
we
already
can
getting
we
into
can.
that, yeah.
That's not even the Midlands. That's a
No,
northern
yeah.
thing as
But
well.
I'm just thinking, even in the Midlands alone, like you go anywhere, you go 5 miles down the road, it's a different answer. So just this idea that like Denmark,
Mhm.
Sweden, Norway, or whatever they were back then, having the exact same burial practices over 400 years is just, we need to kind of let go that it's this neat sort of category.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have the Vikings who've come to England and settled.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's another group of Vikings they'll change culturally because they're going to
Mhm.
adapt to, I guess, being like isolated from changes
Yeah,
in Scandinavia, and they'll be adapted by the local surroundings, and because it's not like they just kept themselves, they will have
yeah,
traded and networked and mixed with Anglo-Saxons. So you have this other group that will be completely different to Scandinavians. So it's a lot more
yeah.
complex.
I also think we talk a lot about Scandinavians coming over to England, and we obviously talk a little bit about sort of unfree people being taken elsewhere from England, but this idea of England to Scandinavia migration doesn't come up as much, but in theory, people probably are going the other way as well as coming here. So it's just that figuring out the
Mhm.
different nuances of everything there.
Mhm. Before I get on to my
Yeah.
opinions of
Yes.
what do you call it? What do you call a bread roll?
Oh, okay. So I've lived in Birmingham for I feel like I would call it a BAP.
A bap. See, I guess for any
Yeah.
Americans or anybody outside of the UK, we all argue
Yeah.
over what you call the little bit of bread that you make a sandwich in. So not like two slices of bread, like that little bread roll thing that you cut in half and make a sandwich in. There is a huge argument whether it's a barm cake, a bread roll, a bap. See, we're in Yorkshire, we're surrounded by like baps and barm cakes, but
Yeah.
in West Yorkshire, there's this like little area where we all call it a tea cake,
Oh,
and
yeah.
a, a tea cake to most people is like a current tea cake
Yes.
and a
Yeah.
sweet thing. So it's in the chat. People are like, it's a balm, it's a tea.
Yeah. I,
It's
I I know Nottingham is very firm on its cobness to the point that you go to Nottingham
oh
Castle and
cob, yeah,
there's cob merch everywhere, and you're like, okay, yep, fine. Yeah, I remember
a
sort of
cob, yeah.
University of Leicester sort of like on campus sort of canteens. I went and I was like, okay, I'll get a bacon cob, and it wasn't the type of bread I was expecting for a cob, and I was like, oh no, we just have different considerations of what this bread is.
Mm. Oh, that's just reminded me of so when I went to Venice.
Yeah,
Obviously, it was Brits. Our coffee. We order a cappuccino,
yeah.
latte,
Oh,
um,
a
flat
cappuccino in
white.
Italy
Okay,
is a tricky situation.
okay. No, well, it's worse than that. So I was in this lovely little Airbnb, and it was a lovely like old lady that ran it.
Mhm.
She spoke a little bit of English, but not tons. I probably didn't know much about like English culture. So for breakfast, she was like, "Would you like a coffee?" I'm like, "Yeah, can I have a latte, please?" And she looked at me a little bit confused and was like, "Latte? Would you like it
Oh,
warm?"
yeah.
And I was like, "Yeah, please. Obviously, I want my coffee warm with my breakfast." And then she just comes out of the kitchen with this warm mug, well, warm like glass cup of
Yep, it's
milk,
just milk. Yep.
uh, and just looked at me like really confused. I was like, "Why does this odd Englishman want warm milk with his breakfast?" And I was like, I still drank it though. I was
It's
too
that
polite. I was
politeness. You're
like,
just like, oh, I made my
"Yeah,
mistake. I'm gonna drink it.
I'm just gonna own the mistake. I'm just gonna like take my milk and like it, my warm milk as well."
I mean, sometimes warm
It
milk is
was
nice.
yeah, yeah. I ate it before bed and like a little cookie in my tum tum just before sleep. Right. Okay, so my opinion on
Yep, yep, go for it. Hit me
the
with
the Repton
it.
Warrior. Um, no, I just really hate that there is nothing there to mark the grave.
Okay.
There's no plaque. There's no
Yeah,
little things sat in the ground because obviously it's on the land of the like private boys' school.
yeah.
Because even when I went up to go around and look at like the site,
Mm,
um, the lady came. I was like, "What are you doing here?" And I'm like, "Oh, this cool thing was buried here." Like I would want to look at it, and she's like, "No, come on, get off our property, like shoo shoo shoo." Um,
yeah.
and that really frustrates me that there isn't even just like a little plaque to commemorate. Because I have this thought, and I think it's
Mm,
probably more as I've got older. I appreciate that as much as I love history and I love learning, this is still somebody's grave, and they were
yeah.
still that's where they were put, and that's where they were intended to stay. They weren't intended to be dug up.
Mm,
It's that's their spot, and we kind of come along, we dig it up, and obviously we can learn so much from it. But now he gets put in a museum somewhere, his goods get scattered, and he's taken from his resting
yeah.
spot, and we don't know what comes after. Anybody who tells you they know what comes after life doesn't know. We don't know. So maybe we fucked up his whole thing. I don't know. Probably not, but maybe we did. Maybe like we just messed up his thing. Um,
Yeah.
but it's just this idea that we've taken it, we put it in a museum, and yeah, we've learned a lot. Like I'm grateful for that, but also just put like a plaque, put something there to commemorate what was there before. I just find it a little bit disrespectful, and it really frustrates me.
Yeah, what I really like about Yelling in Denmark, which is obviously the two big burial mounds, there's the church in the middle. In theory, they potentially found Gorm the Old under the floor of the church. Um, they obviously did the excavation, got the information they needed, reburied the skeleton, and just in the church floor, there's just a little mark where like they're buried. And I just think that that's kind of a nice touch. It's saying like, here is the history, here is, what happened, but we're not sort of putting the glass windows on it. It's not sort of a spectator sport. It's just this person is here, we've reburied them. I quite like
Mm-hmm.
how they've done
I
that
like
there.
that.
It's respectful, yeah.
Would there be any difference really if
Hmm.
the skeleton was in the museum with a little plaque explaining what it was versus putting that skeleton back in the ground and having either the
Yeah.
goods or replica goods with the same information? I don't think it would really affect the person's experience of learning, but I don't know. It feels like
I
there's that respect thing to it.
it's obviously a really long conversation, but I guess it's that question of like, do we need to see these skeletons as, these skeletons rather than recreations of skeletons in heritage and museum settings to appreciate them? Like, is there
Mm-hmm.
still this sort of aspect of curiosity, macabre? Like, do we need to take them away and put them on display to make that impact, or can we just sort of do it in a different way? But obviously that's a
Most
long
people,
conversation. Yeah.
it is, yeah. Most people wouldn't know if it was
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
replica or not. But also, I do love the macabre, so
Yeah. I
it
mean,
it
humans
it's,
are
it is a
obsessed with
tough
death.
one.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, says the person who studies it.
It's
um,
me.
but I think even just a plaque would cheer
Yeah.
me up a little bit. I would love to start like a little petition, just be like, just put a fucking plaque there. Like,
Yeah.
put something, just a little, even if it's like a little wooden one with a little thing that you stuck in the ground. It's not going to affect anybody, but just
Yeah.
some sort of commemoration or like something just to say this was here.
Yeah, because I think there was a documentary that Kat Jarman did, who obviously has done a lot with like the radiocarbon dating at Repton, who she was on the documentary showing where the grave was, but she had to use like a GPS to find exactly where it was. And it feels like this is an important enough historical moment
Yeah.
to just say, like, hey, just so you know, you're here where this happened. It doesn't have to be like sensationalist or anything like that. It could just be as simple as like, so and so was found here on, X excavation,
Mhm.
and this is what this means. Like, it doesn't have to be anything more than that, but just sort of acknowledging the history of where we are, and
Mm. Yeah, when I went, I had to just look at like the old drawings and
yeah,
that would say where it was and kind of try and figure it out. And the the church is you have like the church graveyard, which is kind of public, and then you go through a little gate, and then the warrior site is there, but then
yeah,
it's you're on the public school, the little, and they're obviously not interested in the
yeah,
that. And I just don't think they probably care. And it's yeah, I just find it quite sad. I would much prefer like just a little something.
yeah. Because I guess,
But,
I always sort of use this expression of like, we as people can't leave the past in the past. So it's that case of like, when and where do we bring it out? And sort of, it's very selective sometimes, and maybe just sort of being
mhm.
quite neutrally acknowledging of
Yeah,
where things are is quite important.
it's a it is a huge topic because
Yeah,
then I guess it's would you go put all the mummies back into the tombs in Egypt, or do you
yeah,
like? But really, when you as much as cool as it is when you think about it on a humanity side, it's
mm,
that's that's where they were intended to rest, and I guess it's how much stock you put in that. But
yeah,
I don't know. I feel like wherever I get put, I would probably like to stay there,
mm,
particularly if I believed that there was something further or after. I probably
yeah.
would quite like to remain there. But then again, probably doesn't really matter, does it? It probably makes no difference. But
See, I'm going to have to like contradict your really lovely statement there and be, because I'm an archaeologist, I've specifically said to everyone who knows me, I want to be buried in the weirdest way possible. So 200 years from now,
oh yeah,
archaeologists look at me
nice.
and go, what on earth is that?
Okay, okay, I'm gonna save that. And I'm
Yeah.
gonna we do the look when we do the Q&A after.
Yeah.
I'm gonna because I know you've thought about it,
I know
so
I
I'm gonna
have a lot of thoughts about this.
I know. So I'm gonna say this. If anybody listening wants to find out what that is, you're gonna have to join our Patreon and listen to the Q&A because I know you're gonna have some really
Yeah.
bizarre
It's up here,
ways.
yeah.
So yeah, I can't wait to hear this. All right, let's wrap this up and we'll do the Q&A.
Yeah.
And like I said, we'll do we when we spoke beforehand, we have we probably planned out like 2 or 3 episodes that we could
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
So hopefully this isn't the last time that we see you on here,
Yeah, hopefully.
and we can do a few more in the future because yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
We've
thank you.
learned things, and I'm really excited for looking at that kind of culture behind
Yeah.
burying and how we determine what is Viking Scandinavian, especially when they start to assimilate into kind
Yeah.
of you're not meant to say Anglo-Saxon now, are you? Like people of
It depends
early
what
England.
discipline you're in. Different disciplines have different thoughts on the term Anglo-Saxon, but we'll just use air quotations for now.
Okay, yeah. So as they start to live here longer, and that kind of
Yeah.
those lines are blurred, how we can spot these graves. I think that's a really interesting topic, and I look forward to discussing that. Do you have any public persona you want to plug? Do you have a like an
Uh,
Instagram or papers people
yeah.
can read?
Yeah, so I'm RK Emma on Instagram. So start spelling archaeology, hit the E, and then switch to Emma. And then I am ML Tom, so EMLTHOM on Twitter/X. Yeah, various bits and pieces sort of coming out and about.
Mhm. Mhm. Uh, I like the way you assumed that everyone could spell archaeology because I struggle with
Okay,
that
yeah, I should
so
probably
much.
specify the English way
No,
as
no, I'm
well. So,
joking.
like, not the
Oh,
American
is there
way.
a difference? Oh, is there a
Yeah,
difference between
yeah. So,
English and
if
American?
I need to get this the right way around. The Americans drop the A. So, English archaeology is ARCHAE, and then for the purpose of my handle, EMMA. So Emma, but Americans spell it without the extra A, so it's ARCHEOLOGY.
I'm gonna blame that on me struggling to spell it my entire life now because I just didn't
No,
know there was
no,
a difference. I
just
feel like I've just
pick
seen it
whichever one
different.
you want. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's that's the reason why I've been confused about archaeology and its spelling. Okay, for me, it's Daniel_Farrand1 on Instagram, Horns of Odin for the business, Nordic Mythology podcast across the board. That's Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. If you would like to see our lovely faces as we chat, all the episodes go to YouTube, and you get them early. You get early access on our Patreon as well. And that's a wrap.